everyone. My name is Naseam Ahmadi. I'm with Earnscliffe Strategy Group's Vancouver office, and I'm joining you today from the traditional territories of the Coast Salish peoples, the Tsleil-Waututh, Squamish, and Musqueam First Nations. For those of you who don't know, Earnscliffe Strategy Group is a strategic advisory firm that specializes in strategic communications, public affairs, and public opinion research. And I'll be moderating the session today on the 2020 BC election, lessons learned and where to go from here. We are joined by an excellent panel. We have Nikki Hill, principal with Earnscliffe, and a former senior executive with the BC NDP. We have Danielle Dalzell, a senior consultant with Earnscliffe, and a prior director in strategic communications with the BC government, as well as a former speechwriter for Premier John Horgan. And then we have Carling Dick, principal with Earnscliffe, who previously worked in the Premier's offices of Premier Christy Clark and Premier Gordon Campbell. And we're joined by a very special guest, Chief Bob Chamberlain, the previous Vice President of the Union of BC Indian Chiefs, and of course, very familiar with the issues facing the province that we'll discuss today. So before we get started, there is a question box in the Zoom window that we welcome questions from all of you, and we'll be answering them throughout the session. So to get us started, Danielle, can you provide us an overview of the campaign, including writ period polling, the key ridings, and the results as we understand them today?
Absolutely. We have a little visual aid for this portion. So we see here, Saturday night was a historic night for the NDP. A majority government was called. And we are awaiting final results from the Elections BC on the 16th of November. 500,000 odd outstanding mail-in ballots are yet to be counted, but a majority government has been called and is predicted. We won't know exactly the seats that will be called. Some could change from the preliminary count. Here we see the party standings at dissolution: 41 seats for the Liberal Party, 41 for the BC NDP, 2 for the Green, and 2 independents. 1 was including former BC Green leader Andrew Weaver. In slide 2, we see a dramatic change. Predicted seats currently 55 for the NDP, 29 for the BC Liberals, and 3 for the Greens. We see on slide 4 and 5, we can see that the geographic result, slide 3, sorry, go back. The polling maintained consistency throughout the election. The BC NDP ran a relatively positive campaign, successful campaign, didn't have a lot of missteps. The BC Liberals had a few candidate mishaps, and you can see that the NDP sustained and grew a bit to the result. The Greens as well, there wasn't a huge amount of movement. They came in with 3 seats and they left with 3 seats. So we had sort of a static campaign throughout in terms of polling. On slide, we can see in the map of riding results, we have the BC NDP dominated in the Lower Mainland, held a lot of seats and grew in unpredicted places. The Fraser Valley, Langley, those are not traditional BC NDP strongholds by any means, but they gained a lot of seats in those areas. For rural BC, they retained 4 and gained a 5th seat. And you can see here as well, the BC Greens jumped off the island for the first time in their party history and secured West Vancouver Sea to Sky Highway. So that's will be a nice gain for them. In rural BC, we can see that the BC Liberals still have a lot of representation there, which the Premier noted the day after the election and reached out to folks saying, doesn't matter how you vote, where you live, we're going to do our best to represent you. He also indicated that he'll be traveling more to rural BC than he was able to in a minority government, which kept him in Victoria a lot of the time, particularly when the House was in session. So those are the results. That's what we saw on Saturday night. Again, the final election count will come in from Elections BC. The 16th of November is when we'll expect that, and that will include the 500,000 outstanding mail-in ballots.
Thanks, Danielle. Yes, we are still counting votes, so we don't want to presuppose any individual results. But as you mentioned, we predict that the BC NDP will form government. So, Nikki, why do you think Premier Horgan and his party were successful in this election?
Standard unmute. I think, there are actually a number of reasons, and I think we should probably start with the premier. There was a premier in place who went into not only the election with really high popularity, one of the most popular premiers in Canada, but had been consistently in that place in the pre-election period as well before the pandemic. And I think that's important. I think, over the last 3.5 years, John Horgan's demonstrated to the public that he's someone that, they can trust, that they want to have a coffee with, that they want to go out and play disc golf with. And I think that people really connected with him and saw no need to change. And part of that change is, I think, in 3.5 years, the NDP's really countered what was a long time message from the BC Liberals about inability to manage the economy, inability to balance budgets. And so the public was able to see that actually hasn't been the case. We've had a strong economy. It's actually been thriving in BC. And so we get to an election when people may not be looking for change and they do want stable government. Those factors come into play. I think, it would also be remiss not to look at the contrast points. There were at a time in a pandemic when people want health and education and childcare and public services. And I would suggest to actually take care of each other. We did see, BC Liberal commitments around things that people might respond to otherwise, like PST, not landing, because I think there was a high concern about what that actually meant to services in the long run. But, I do think, pandemic aside, and now we're through the campaign, that it is really important to acknowledge that was a really strong NDP campaign. They spent years going out and recruiting, really great candidates around the province, former mayors, leads of associations. The voters had a great choice of who they were voting for locally, and the campaign was pretty solid. So I think that needs to be credit there as well.
Thanks, Nikki. And I want to turn to Carling. The results of the election will be a disappointment to the BC Liberals and the leader, Andrew Wilkinson, who indicated his intention to step aside as leader. So what factors do you think led to this outcome?
Well, I think there was a few reasons. So as in 2017, the electorate started to shift. And the BC Liberals, I think, thought of 2017 as a tie. They came out of the election with the most amount of seats. They were only one short of a majority, and thought that, they needed to make a few tweaks in the coming years and then they would have an opportunity to govern again. But the electorate continued to shift and their priorities shifted, and the BC Liberals didn't notice or react to that. So I think that's one reason. Another reason is during the campaign, Nikki sort of alluded to this. Several of the BC Liberal candidates had some gaffes, and the party was slow to respond and didn't do a good job of communicating to the voters. So, I think for those reasons and others, they ended up with the result that they did. And I'm hoping as a party member that we'll take the time to digest the results and figure out what the future holds.
And COVID and keeping British Columbians safe were key issues in the recent election campaign. And Chief Bob, I want to ask you about the challenges of the pandemic, its impacts on healthcare, the economy, and how these issues might constrain what the government hopes to achieve. Oh, you're on mute, Chief.
Okay, thank you for that. I believe that John Horgan's government has done well in addressing the COVID first phase, if you like, or the first stage that we've gone through in terms of prioritizing the medical assistance and the availability of equipment. And now that they're continuing, they're going to be able to have the same strategies, the same thinking, be prepared to address any emerging new conditions that arise as we enter phase 2. And I think that that would then allow them to be able to continue to provide the high level of medical assistance as this pandemic continues down the road.
Great. And Danielle, the BC government remains the only NDP provincial government in Canada. So how do you think this will impact the province's relationship with other provinces and the federal government?
Well, I think through COVID-19, we've seen unprecedented cooperation with the federal government and among provinces. I'm sure Premier Horgan didn't anticipate finding common ground with the Premier of Ontario, for instance, over the past 6 months, but he has. And the Premier's leveraged those relationships and worked with the federal government to make significant gains across Canada, including paid sick leave. And I think he'll continue to keep that approach. The relationship with the federal government continues to be positive, and I think the NDP is uniquely suited to respond to something like a pandemic. NDP governments invest in public services. We're the party of healthcare, and they believe in bolstering those services, and it's what you need to get through a pandemic, as we're seeing. So innovative ideas are going to come from this NDP government, and hopefully make their way across Canada, as we've already seen.
And Carling, are there one or two questions from the audience that you'd like to share?
There are. We've got a couple coming in here, and I definitely encourage others on the line, if you have questions, please use the Q&A box, and I'll try and get to all of them if we can. So off the top, I'm gonna give this one to Danielle, because she talked about the results at the top of the webinar. Danielle, how significant is it that the BC Green Party has won a seat in the Vancouver area?
Well, I mean, they've retained their 3 seats. The relationship is different. We're not going to be governing under cooperative CASA agreements, so the relationship with the government is different than it was over the past 3.5 years. But that is to come off the island for the first time in their, I think, 30 some odd year history and gain a seat is good. And I'm sure they'll be celebrating that. We'll see if that holds. I mean, the motivations for voters who would traditionally have a home, perhaps with the BC Liberals, did they vote for the BC Greens because they didn't feel at home with the BC Liberals at this time? And where those votes will go in the next election, if they'll hold or not, remains to be seen.
I think we're going to have to wait and see until after the final vote count, as I believe there's 5,000 or 7,000 votes that remain uncounted for that riding we're speaking of. So of course, I think they're going to be very hopeful. And like everybody else, we're going to be paying very close attention to those final numbers as they come out to the public.
You're absolutely right, Chief Bob. Thanks for that. Nikki, this one's over to you on this one. You might have got asked this on CBC on election night, I'm not sure. Why didn't calling an election during a pandemic end up hurting the NDP more?
I really think it comes down to the fact that, I think there was a message that the NDP could continue a stable government. And I do think that's important, in fairness to people during a pandemic, being nervous about seeing any changes to their lives, but also having seen that the NDP was really focusing in a pandemic response on people. And I think there's a real story about centering people in this campaign. And we'll talk a little bit more about it when we talk about how to approach the government today. But being able to say that there was a people-focused response, that is where we're talking about getting women back into the workforce who may be impacted through lack of childcare. Those are topics that came up consistently. When you're talking about ensuring that there's protections for seniors, that's what I think the public wanted to hear. And we are in a phase where people want to know that there's that societal structure that's going to protect people, not knowing what's really ahead of us in the future.
Excellent. Naz, do you want me to do one more before I throw it back over to you? So this one's actually going to be to me. So someone's asking who the likely contenders are to replace Andrew Wilkinson and what's the expected timeline on the leadership race. So don't know the timeline on the leadership race yet. The party will be meeting in the coming days to talk about that. I'm hopeful it will be a longer timeline. I think the party, like I said, needs some time some introspection and figure out, why we lost and go forward. So I hope there's a bit of time before they get started. In terms of who the likely contenders are, there's a lot of names being thrown around right now, and I think that list will get shorter depending on what the leadership race looks like and when it is and all that kind of stuff. But we're hearing some of the same names who ran in the last leadership. So Michael Lee, Todd Stone, Diane Watt. Diane has said she's not interested, but maybe someone will convince her. Jazz Johal is often kicked around as someone who people think would be good to lead the party. Kevin Falcon's name comes up almost every time, but I'm sure there'll be others, and especially if there's some time taken before things get kicked off. So, Naz, with that, I'll pass it back over to you.
Perfect, thanks. And Nikki, I wanted to pick up on some of the points you were mentioning earlier about the pandemic and the various challenges the government's facing. So particularly with respect to fiscal impacts of the pandemic, to what extent do you think this might limit the government's ability to maneuver? And how would you advise stakeholders to factor these considerations when they're approaching government?
Yeah, and thanks for that. I think, there's a lot of similarities between approaching this government as there were before the election. And, keeping in mind that when the NDP came in 2017, they did find that there were significant issues around funding for, ICBC, for example, that they had to adjust some of the planning and thinking. And I think we are still in a space in which the public understands that money needs to be spent on the pandemic, on healthcare, on response and economic recovery. So I think, though, what we also had before the election was the release of the economic recovery plan. Gives people a really good timeline and sense about where the government is going to be looking. But one thing that always has struck me in working with stakeholders and this government on advice, and I think this will hold true even more, is being able to take a collaborative approach. And so I've been in many rooms where a minister has called out to business and nonprofits and other sectors to work together and to bring forward innovative ideas. I think of housing and the number of times where developers have been essentially asked to go and work with those nonprofits to find solutions in the community, and they have. I think about looking at announcements around childcare going into workplaces. These are big problems we have to solve together, and as a long list of needs will continue to grow and stakeholders reach out, I think the more innovative and collaborative and being solutions focused and talking to this government is going to get people in alignment with those priorities, but also into space in which they can find ways to meet all of those goals.
Naz, can I jump in for 1 second? Because just want to pick up on something you said, Nikki. Someone's asking us, will the government be amenable to providing additional financial supports above and beyond the package that was announced pre-election? Do you have any insight on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's a bit early to judge that right now. They do need to come back and look at how to get that recovery benefit out, that $1,000 for families of certain income levels. That will be a huge priority to get out. And then I think one thing that's been apparent during economic recovery as well is being very data driven, taking actually a look at which demographics in the province have been hardest hit and trying to find ways to get people back to work. So I think, that is, as we go through the second wave, looking at where the impact is. We of course have better data than we had going through the first wave about particularly areas like hospitality and tourism. But as we actually get a long-term view about who needs the most supports in the province, that's where the thinking will go into it. And I think there has, like I said, been a pretty big data-driven approach to these solutions.
And speaking of being data-driven and focusing on those hardest hit, the pandemic shone a spotlight on health inequities in Canada. So Chief Bob, I was wondering if you could speak to how Indigenous groups and the unique circumstances they're facing in BC and across Canada factors into the situation and what the BC government might do to approach these issues.
When we consider the place that First Nations have found themselves historically, and not just this before this election, but before many elections, have been marginalized in many different ways. And when I consider where we may go post-election here, I consider the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People legislation. And this is something that's extremely significant in Canada. We're the only province that has taken that level of step to ensure the implementation. And I believe now that with that and building upon that and the commitments that were made during the election campaign, is we're going to begin to see a move towards shared decision-making. And I say that because I was part of the Broughton Fish Farm Letter of Understanding, where we did implement the UN Declaration, where there was free, prior, and informed consent. And by doing that, we were able to replace the very combative environment of consultation. And so with that being stated in the election platform, and also the building on the legislation, I believe that that sets a table for some fundamental changes which will provide greater certainty for the economy. By having a shared decision-making model, it'll take away an exorbitant amount of money that's been spent in the courts. And certainly every time you go to court, it's the death of reconciliation. And I have some very high hopes for what we're about to witness.
And that shared decision making, it speaks to Nikki's comments before about the collaborative approach. Shifting gears a bit, Carling, I want to ask you about energy issues and exports and their role in economic recovery in the months ahead.
Well, natural resource is a major economic driver in the province, and I think it will continue to be so going forward. The Premier has a natural resource background. He was a critic and has supported the natural resource in the past. So he mentioned several times during the campaign his government approved LNG Canada. In the platform, it talks about supporting an LNG industry going forward. And so, and then the other thing I would say is one of the things the Premier said, it was either on election night or the day after, and Nikki could probably remind me, but was that he was disappointed that they didn't get more seats in rural British Columbia. And he's keen to travel the province and hear from those constituents. So, we know that a lot of those communities in rural British Columbia rely on natural resources, and the Premier is going to be keen to listen to those constituents and support those constituents and the natural resource industry. So I think there's a huge role to play, and it will continue to be an important industry in British Columbia.
And Carling, what are your thoughts on the role of renewables in BC's energy mix?
I think they're going to play a huge role. So in the government's first term, they, as many people know, they released their Clean BC plan, which talks about renewables and their role in the economy and in the energy sector going forward. And so I think the government would like to see expansion of those areas. We've heard government interested in hydrogen as an alternative energy. They're, very interested in promoting electricity, electric vehicles, all that kind of thing. So I think we'll continue to see a strong focus in that area going forward.
And on the note about the focus and expanding renewables, Danielle, what are your thoughts on the importance of renewable energy and environmental issues to British Columbians? And also, what priorities do you think the government might pursue in these issues?
Well, with Clean BC, we saw a climate action plan, and with emissions targets that arguably the most aggressive in North America. There is a clear path forward to get to those emissions targets, and they have doubled down on that. In the election campaign, we saw that they are pursuing Clean BC. They're going to continue those policies, and they're going to double down on them. And we also saw support of transition to local coastal economies and sustainable economies while protecting ecosystems there. So we saw those clearly outlined. As Carling mentioned, support of LNG Canada means that they have to build out more sustainable energy to meet those targets. That's also, as Chief Bob was mentioning, has to be done in concert with reconciliation with Indigenous peoples, as it has. So we're going to see a focus on that. The Premier said at some point during the last couple of weeks of the campaign that he wants to bring all solutions, innovation to the table to help us meet those targets. That's open to ideas, open to innovation. From folks in BC, where some of this technology is being built. It's groundbreaking, and government has an open door to that. We will see that continue.
Right.
Can I jump in, Naseam? When I think about where we're going to be going forward in terms of the environment, the NDP campaign platform is very clear in doubling the money that's going to be put into the BC Salmon Habitat Rehabilitation Innovation Fund, BC SHRIF for short. In addition to what Danielle just mentioned about the habitat protections. And I think that now with the attention that's being paid, and rightfully so, to the environment and things such as wild salmon, that we're going to be able to see efforts that flow from that funding commitment that will touch all corners of the province. And so we're going to see a very broad benefit. We're going to address certainly a crisis issue in terms of BC salmon in British Columbia. And so we'd be able to see a very broad, what would be and could be considered a very broad and general reconciliation effort as well with First Nations, as this is a critical food staple for virtually all First Nations across the province. So doing rehabilitation work and environmental protection is going to be very, very welcome, and it's going to contribute to just so many different aspects of the British Columbia economy. I think it's a really, really great investment.
And Nikki, Danielle's overview earlier showed a prediction that the NDP will transition from a minority to a majority government. So what differences should stakeholders be aware of with a majority?
Yeah, I mean, and if that's the case, and as you said, we're still waiting, but it's tracking well. I think that there are some significant differences. I think Danielle touched on just even the ability to leave the legislature when there's a session in increases the ability to not just get to rural BC and talk to voters, but it also means being able to meet with more stakeholders, having more engagement. A minority government, no matter where it is, has a little bit more structural challenges to it. But, the Premier went into this election looking for a majority mandate, and that was for a reason. And a lot of that reason, I think, in the context of where we are in the world, even without the pandemic, is the ability to be more nimble on policy direction. There were priorities that the NDP had coming in 2017, again, not being elected, but with the partnership between the Green Party, they didn't make it through in policy priorities. I think that, that level of frustration about not being able to expand on something, $10 a day childcare, for example. But what the Premier has also described a bit is like backroom negotiations for each policy issue. What we would hope to see is policy being able to move at a faster pace of government, and also that more additional input from stakeholders onto direction in this majority situation. And quite frankly, I think as we also look to Ottawa and see the machinations around a potential federal election, having some of that stability now to claim the second wave is pretty critical, and the majority government should be able to create that.
And with the majority government, Chief Bob, how does Premier Horgan and the BC government secure ongoing support from British Columbians, particularly those who supported NDP?
I believe that Premier Horgan and the government are going to be watched very closely in terms of the commitments that they've made. They're going to be watched very closely in terms of how they continue to meet the health needs of British Columbians as we enter into phase 2 of the COVID pandemic. Also going to be watched very closely in how they assist different businesses of all sizes stay afloat so we can have some meaningful employment and still be able to provide a measure of tax revenue for the province. And I know with First Nations, of course, going to be watching very closely. After coming out of the previous Liberal government's majority situation and the new relationship and how far that went or didn't go, we're going to be very focused on how well the UN Declaration is going to be implemented and how priorities are set to move that forward in a meaningful and fundamental way. And I think it's going to be really important to show to British Columbians that there's nothing to fear about a shared decision-making process and how this actually leads to economic certainty for industry.
Right, thanks.
Yeah, sorry to interrupt. I have a follow-up for Chief Bob on that from one of our attendees. So you were talking just now, Chief Bob, about the Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples Act. And one of our attendees is asking, said the government committed both in the legislation and again in the election context to review and revise all the legislation with a view to implementation. They also said they'd be looking to Indigenous nations to set the prioritization of those revisions. How will Indigenous leadership set that prioritization? Which body processes, given that the government will be looking to you for that?
That's a really good question. I'm really grateful that we have a mature relationship in terms of continuity now between the First Nation Leadership Council and the NDP, now enjoying what's going to be or appears to be a majority government. First Nations in British Columbia have prioritized lists of things that need to be accomplished through resolutions at the various First Nation organizations, whether it's the Union of BC Indian Chiefs, First Nation Summit, or BC AFN. So this function will continue and priorities will be able to be struck there as one place. And of course, different nation groups involved in various processes, both federally and provincially, are going to be able to give that measure of direction as well. And also, the government has demonstrated a clear commitment for wild salmon in British Columbia. And it's something that I'm very passionate about, but I know that this is so critical to the environment. And it's also very critical for a very important food source for people. So I think that we're going to see how that holds hands very clearly with environmental protection, water quality, global warming, and so on. It just touches so many things. So I have every confidence that the government is going to have more than enough direction and prioritization, but certainly also with the commitment to the Secretariat for the United Nations Declaration of Rights and Indigenous Peoples Act. I think that's going to be a very key area that many British Columbians are going to be focusing on.
Thank you for adding that. And on the other hand, Carling, I want to ask you about stakeholders who might be disappointed with the election's results, and how do you think they might approach government, and how would you advise them?
Sure. Nikki actually touched on this in one of her answers a little bit earlier, but it's advice we give to most of our clients is to, and no matter who's in government, is to find areas of alignment and areas where the government is looking for to consult or for ideas. So one example I can give you is Clean BC. So the government came out with Clean BC, they had about 75% of their targets met in that plan, and we're looking for ideas for how to meet that other 25%. And so there's an opportunity for organizations to go to the government with their ideas. Another one Nikki talked about was housing. So, you know, look at what your organization's priorities are and where they might align with things that the government is working on, and go and talk to this government, or the new government. Many of our clients have had many of our clients have had success going in and having a conversation. I know the government is open to those conversations, and so encouraging people to engage, come with ideas, and find areas of alignment.
Right. It brings it back to that theme of innovation and collaboration.
Yeah, we actually have a question on that theme, if I can ask it, Naz, if that's okay.
Of course, I didn't plug that on purpose.
One focus of CASA was investing in tech and innovation, perhaps more driven by the Greens. In looking forward, how important will tech be to the NDP government? Nikki, can you take that one?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that actually when it comes to tech and innovation, those were probably dual priorities. And I do think that in a lot of the CATS agreement that, you know, of course, was come to by negotiation and agreement on what will be in there. So you can see themes from both of the parties in that previous agreement. Tech and innovation have to remain a top priority, and particularly where we are, here, like physically where we are at home as people trying to work within a pandemic. BC is a center for many companies which have been able to help with those adjustments to work life, help with figuring out healthcare response as well. There's been just such a high need. And I do actually think this is one of those spaces where stakeholders can, I think back to, it's been said before in the last couple of months, is there's no, break this box in case of pandemic and grab the book of what to do. That's where stakeholders can come in with ideas and come in with solutions that they've been creating. And I think it's really important. And I think more than ever, that really accounts for the tech sector.
Carling, are there more questions that you can share with the group?
Yeah, definitely. I actually have another one for Nikki. Sorry, Nikki, 2 in a row, but I think this one relates to some of the work you've been doing. So how do you anticipate the new government supporting BC's post-secondary institutions to help them deliver quality and accessible education for BC students? PSI budgets have been impacted by COVID, especially due to over-reliance on international students. Can you speak to that?
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely a sector that's going to need to have more input moving ahead. And I think it is one of those places to take a look at where the data. So not only have post-secondary institutions been impacted, though, it is students and youth. And I think that keeping both of those issues on a parallel path is really important, because you have institutions which, of course, need funding to continue and have moved to largely online practices. But you also have young people who need to have access to training, and we don't want to have a generation of youth lost who can't start down their career path because of the impact on the pandemic. So I think we'll continue to see focuses on what is most needed in the province. So there has been a huge focus on trades training, for example. I don't see that going, particularly when we're looking at infrastructure projects and training. But I think that the sector, post-secondary, is going to have a large voice. They already do. Whether or not that money is going to be coming from government funding is unclear, because you do need to look at, is there more benefit, for example, to get funding and support to young people directly so that they can engage in the post-secondary education system. And those will be some big issues for a new cabinet to be working through. But I think also really important to ensure that all voices are at the table on those issues.
Carling, we have time for one more question from the audience.
Sure, we've gotten a couple of questions with regards to the relationship with Ottawa. So Danielle, you'd mentioned this earlier. I'm going to give this one to you. How much does winning a majority strengthen the government's hand in dealing with other provinces and with Ottawa?
Well, I think it helps to have solid plans for the next 4 years that can't be interrupted by an anticipated election. And so when you're negotiating with other parties, you can have a solid plan moving forward that helps with everybody. And you don't have to negotiate every single piece with the Greens moving forward as they did. I think that they'll continue to pursue the chart that they've been pursuing with the federal government and with other governments during COVID, as I mentioned earlier, bringing ideas to the table and working really collaboratively to get change, not just for BC, but across the country as well.
Great. And before we wrap up, I have one last question for all of you. What were the key lessons learned from this campaign, and what might we expect from the new government? So I'll start with Nikki.
Key lessons from the campaign. Well, I think, everyone's still unpacking them because we don't actually have that full result. When we do, there's some things I'm, as someone who's worked in campaigns for 25 years, I'm really interested to unpack more on some of those values questions and what the public was voting for and what they weren't voting for. And I think, as we look at where there were issues around candidates' approaches and stances, whether on various community issues, but also when, there were allegations around homophobia and sexism, how did that play into the campaign? I don't think we can see that yet. And the reason I think that's important because it does actually influence how you're talking to government. If there's been a change or maybe not so much as a change as a institutionalization of how people want to have society look, whether they want to see more social purpose in their businesses, whether they want government to be taking different approaches, the values are really, really important in the months moving forward. So I'm still looking forward to final results to start digging into that a little bit more.
Thank you, Nikki. And Danielle?
I think a big thing to be learned is that the solid, steady focus of the BC NDP over the last 3.5 years of building a strong, sustainable economy with good jobs and communities, and of investing in the services that people rely on, of tackling head-on huge issues of affordability like housing, namely, are generally supported, as well as their focus on people, specifically during the pandemic and beyond. You can see broad public support for that. So for me, a takeaway is definitely that they do have support in how they've been governing, and they do have now a strong signal from the electorate that they can continue to do more of the same as they tackle some of the biggest challenges ever facing any of us, really. So that's a huge takeaway. As Nikki says, drilling down on the riding by riding and all of the different values polling and seeing how that works out will be is another sort of political nerdy part of me that will pursue that. But I think those are really foundational, important lessons to learn. And I think Premier Horgan is he's very honest and likable. Really what you see is what you get. And I think people have come to know that over the last 3.5 years and come to trust and like him. And that's very important as well.
And Carling, I know you touched on lessons learned on your first question, but was there anything you wanted to expand on?
I would just say, I think there's still a role for the BC Liberal Party to play in British Columbia. BC Liberals have lots of seats in rural British Columbia, but definitely need to think about how to make some changes so that they can be more relevant to folks in the Lower Mainland. So I'm looking forward to working with the party and working through all that, and maybe forming government in 4 years.
Chief Bob, any final thoughts from you?
I believe that what we experienced here in the campaign was society sending a very clear message to all parties. And what I mean by that is the need for diversity that's found within the candidates. I think that was something that was very clear that I picked up on throughout the campaign, more about being able to accept more people rather than just having a very narrow view of what are the important pillars of society. I think that came through loud and clear. I agree with the comments about the likability of Premier John Horgan and how that resonated with voters. And again, but it's difficult to be able to pick a point and say, I mean, as a First Nation person, I could say, well, they did the UNDRIPA, so that's why they won. It may not be entirely accurate, but there are so many things that they did accomplish prior to the election that I believe set the foundation to have the majority government that we're facing now. And I believe that now with that continuity, and there was a lot of mention about various ministers not running again, but I don't think enough attention was paid to the predictability of the cabinet that was appointed. There was no changes throughout the 3.5 years. And how rare is that in Canadian politics? So I think that in itself shows some good thinking put into selection of cabinet members. And I think given the diversity conversations that occurred during the campaign, that we'll see that come into the selection of the cabinet coming up.
Right, so there's still a lot left to be learned and to see how it unfolds. Thank you so much to all of the panelists. This was a great discussion. Thank you, Nikki, Danielle, Carling, and especially Chief Bob for participating as our special guest for today. And I want to thank all the participants. If there was a question that we didn't get to today, we'll follow up with you directly. And this webinar was recorded and it will be posted on Earnscliff's YouTube site. And next week, you can tune in again on November 5th at 11 a.m. Pacific time for an analysis of Tuesday's US election. Hope to see you there and thank you.